My name is Adrian. I'm so excited that you're here, and I can't wait to teach you about sewing. I just want to start out by telling you a little bit about myself and how I got into sewing. When I was growing up, my mom had a sewing business where she did heirloom smocking. And of course, we know to keep little ones occupied, you got to give them something to do. And so even from a little kid, I was given things to do like thread pearls or sew simple stitches just to kind of keep me busy while she was working, and I loved it. And so I continued to learn how to sew as I grew up. I inherited some sewing machines and other materials, and then I ended up buying some of my own. I started out making sort of smaller crafts and then things for my house, and then I got into garment sewing, and so that's what I've been doing in recent years. Last year I had what I would consider my pinnacle sewing project, and that was sewing my wedding dress. So I'm really excited that you're here. I can't wait to teach you what we know. And we're going to just start with some basics here in this first Essential Skills series. Before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about what we call ourselves when we sew. So it typically has been called a seamstress over the years. That's sort of the classic term. But a lot of people have taken issue with that term in recent years, saying that it's a little bit biased. It typically would refer to a female who sews. And so it's a little bit out of style nowadays to say seamstress. A lot of times people like to call themselves sewers or sewists. And so that's what we're going to use in these programs. And so let's get started, sewists. So the first part of this video, we're going to go over some basic tools that you might need to get started. We're going to start with some basic items and also discuss some other things that might be helpful depending on the type of project that you have. Feel free to just buy the tools that you need for one project at a time. You certainly don't need to have a complete sewing studio to have a fun time sewing, and you don't need every single tool that we're going to talk about today to get started. But I just wanted to give you an overview of what different kinds of things are used for different purposes, just so you have a general idea of where to get started. If you go into a fabric store or a craft store, and you kind of know what you're looking at and how to choose from one item to another. So the first thing that we're going to start with is talking about what you'll need to cut out your project. And so this right here is a cutting board. This particular one is a cardboard one. This type of cutting board is available in most places, and it is not very expensive, and it's good for general use. This one that I have here is very large, so it's helpful for large scale projects as well. Some pros and cons of this, like I said, it's not very expensive. It's easy to find. Some cons though is it does get damaged pretty easily because it is cardboard. And so if you're going to be doing more heavy duty kind of work, or you're going to be using a rotary cutter, which we're going to talk about in a minute, you're going to need a different kind of cutting board. This is a rotary mat here, and you can see it's made out of plastic. And what's really cool about this kind of cutting board, in addition to being designed for a rotary cutter, is it's a self-healing mat. And so I brought mine here from home, and you can see it has some wear and tear because I've used it. But what you don't see on it is big slices from using a knife on it. And that's because after you cut on this kind of cutting board, after a couple of hours, that little slice is going to heal up. It's pretty cool. So some pros and cons of using this kind of mat. It is smaller, so if you're cutting out something really large, this is probably not going to be big enough. The other thing is they can be a little bit harder to find, and so acquiring one of these can be difficult, and they're a little bit more expensive. But they do last a lot longer. They're very durable. They're self-healing, which means that they're not going to have little grooves in here, which can be too hard on your fabrics and want to snag. And so you can kind of choose which sort of mat. Either mat you want to start with as you're beginning your sewing is totally fine. This here is another kind of rotary mat, but you can see it's a lot smaller than the other one. This one is really designed for small projects and crafts, including quilting. And so as you can see here, in addition to the typical grid that you have different size squares. You also have diagonal measurements that have here their degree marks. And so if you're doing geometric kinds of projects, like I said, quilting and other appliques, things like that, this is the kind of mat that you can use for those smaller items. So now we're ready to talk about what we're going to use to cut out a project. And here I brought my sewing scissors. And so this kind of implement would be fine for any sort of cutting board, whether it's the cardboard kind or a rotary board, as long as you're protecting your table surface when you are cutting. It's really important to use a sharp pair of scissors. So have a pair of scissors that you only use for fabric. As soon as you use them on a piece of paper, they're going to get really dull. And it's just like trying to cook with a dull knife to cut your vegetables with. It's no good. It can ruin your project. And it's also kind of dangerous because you have to work much harder to cut. And so it's important to have sharp scissors and to only use them for sewing. Moving over here, we have our different kinds of rotary cutters. And so you have your small one here for detail work, your medium one, which is for most fabrics. It can be for finer fabrics up to medium width, medium thickness rather. And then you have your larger one, which can do even heavy duty. And so it's not essential to have all the different sizes when you're just beginning. It's fine to have just the medium one or just the larger one. If you want to be able to cut all fabrics, I would suggest this one. It's also important to keep your blades for these sharp when you're cutting to make sure that you're going to cut cleanly when you're cutting out your fabric. And so it's good to have extra blades on hand. Here I have an example of the blades that you would buy, and this is another kind that I have for this size. Here's a tip I have for you. There is a thing in the sewing community that we joke is the craft tax. And so that is to say that sometimes things packaged by craft stores are going to be more expensive than you can find them in other places. This is a great example of that. A lot of times, particularly for this larger size rotary blade, you can find the replacement ones in hardware stores. A lot of times they're in the carpet cutting section. And so when your item here gets dull, you can just replace them, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the brand that you bought your rotary cutter for. But when you're using these, they have a safety feature so that when you're storing them in your bag, they don't cut anything and that you won't accidentally cut yourself. And so for these smaller ones, you're going to press down and it'll release the blade like that, and you'll just slide it back up when you want to cover it back up. For this type, you'll see it has a little trigger, and so that's going to release it so that you can, oh, that locks it. This is going to release it so that you can cut, and it makes it so that it moves like this. And then when you push it the other way, it's locked so it won't move. So there's different kinds of safety features depending on the kind of rotary blade that you get. This one's, again, like the smaller one where it just has a little piece that moves aside. And so that's good to have a handle on when you're going to be using your rotary cutters. Moving over here, we have our different kinds of small scissors. And so this is a pair of embroidery scissors here, and this is what we would call a pair of snips. And so these are going to be used throughout your sewing, either for trimming threads as you sew. Like we said, it's good for hand sewing, for embroidery, or even any other kind of hand sewing. These are just handy to have around. They work the same. It's just a preference of which type that you like. These are gonna, you're gonna slide your fingers in like this. There's different kinds of embroidery scissors you can get. And then this, you hold like this, and it can be easier to use with a sewing machine, for example. It's just your personal preference. There's not really one or the other that's better. It's whichever one that you like. Last but not least here, we have our pinking shears. And so you can see here that they have the jagged edge, and it's going to make a zigzag cut. This is really good for finishing, and so this helps your fabric not unravel once you've sewn your seams and things like that. So this helps to protect your seam and make sure it stays together. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into our sewing projects. So now we're going to be talking about the ways that we measure when we're cutting out our projects, as well as when we're assembling and checking them for fit and things like that later on. So very essential for anybody who's going to sew is going to be a tape measure. And so I have an example here. One thing that I want to point out about these is that if you tie them up in any way when you store them, it can actually stretch them out and make them not very accurate over time. And so even though it looks a little bit messy, it's really better to kind of just keep them like this in your sewing kit, or hung up even is better. So you can just hang them on a hook on the wall if you've got room for that. But any ways that you can store it without really winding it up in any way is best to make sure that it continues to measure accurately. You can see here it's in inches on one side and it's in centimeters on the other. So whether you have you know, a metric project or you have, you know, US measurements on your project, then you're ready to go with your tape measure there. Next, we're going to talk about a seam gauge. And so this one's a really old one that I have, but this is helpful in measuring as you sew. And so, for example, if you're hemming a pair of pants and you want it to be just this much, you can use that to measure as you're sewing to make sure that you're accurate. Anything that's going to require you to measure along the way. This one here goes all the way up to 4 inches. So that's about as wide as you'd ever want to use for a hem or something like that. But this is really handy to have, particularly for garment making. If you're not going to make a garment, this may not be an essential for your sewing kit, but I know that I sure use it with my garment making. Moving over here, this is a type of quilting ruler. And so these are really cool for craft projects because they're clear and you can see through them. So you can even use these with paper projects if you want, but it's intended to be used for sewing. This one goes up to 23 inches this way and up to 5 inches this way. And so it's good for marking long straight lines or measuring across this way. And so it's helpful particularly with fitting patterns when you're doing garment making or for quilting if you're into that kind of project. Last but not least, we have here a curved ruler. And so this is sometimes called a hip curve. It's sometimes just called a curved ruler. This has all kinds of different functions. This is probably my favorite kind of ruler because it does so many different things. And so you have here your straight edge, which is good just as any normal ruler would be used. It also, if you look down here, it has little gradations. And so if you're trying to do really specific measurements, say for a hem, you would have different ways that you can measure it. And again, these are clear, so you can see through it onto your project. What's also nice is this kind of ruler has these little slots. So if you want to mark, for example, where you're going to put a buttonhole or something like that, you can just run your pencil right through there and mark it. That's really handy. And then you might wonder, what on earth do I use this curved part for? And so this is typically used for fit purposes when you're making garments. And so you'll see here, it recommends that you use the hip curve part for 1 through 17. That's this section here. And then this very rounded part is going to be for an armhole curve. And so even though those are the specific recommendations, any sort of rounded parts of patterns, you can use this part to make them fit better. It turns out that human beings aren't flat. We're three-dimensional. And so a lot of pattern pieces for garments are going to be shaped rounded like this, and you're going to have to be able to fit them to the person you're sewing for. The last thing that this has that's really handy is this little hole. You might think that's just for hanging it up, but it actually serves a purpose. And so on your patterns, sometimes you have a marking where it has a circle. And so that lets you trace the circle. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to read a pattern and how to use it in another lesson coming up in our essential skills. This other kind of tracing paper here, you'll see on the package that it says wax free. And so those are going to be your more washable types of tracing paper. So if you have to mark something where it's going to be seen in your final project, you're going to want to choose the kind that says wax free. And then to use with your tracing paper is a tracing wheel. And so this is what you'll use to mark with. As you can see here, this piece I've used quite a bit and it leaves little marks on it, but I'm going to demonstrate how it works. And so if you're going to pretend like this is your fabric here that you want to mark on, you put the colored side facing down where you want to make a mark, and you use your tracing wheel just like this, and it'll leave a mark there for you to follow. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about how to make marks and when to use them when we go over our pattern reading later in the series. But this is the basics that you need to know about tracing paper. I'm personally a really big fan of this because it lets you mark your actual project when you're working. It's also a good way to trace a pattern onto a spare piece of paper. So if you want to preserve your pattern and not cut out your pattern itself, this is a good way to do it, because then you can just transfer it onto an extra piece of paper and you can use it over and over again if it's one that you might want to keep. Other ways that you can mark your project include using chalk. And so this is just standard white chalk like you would see used in a school. And this is a great way. A lot of times tailors will use chalk. There are fancy tailor chalks that you can buy in fabric stores, but this is another craft tax item. You don't need to do that. It's totally fine to use the chalk that you would just find in a school supplies section at any standard store. And so that's a great way to mark as well. Just be aware that it is going to show up quite noticeably on really dark fabrics. And so making sure that you can wash your garment afterward and being mindful that it does get on your fingers a little bit when you're using it. And so being careful to wash your hands before you touch anything else after you use chalk so that you don't have any stray marks anywhere else. The last way that I wanted to discuss marking your project is with one of these pens. This particular one says it's a Mark Be Gone. There's all kinds of different brands and they come in different colors. This one's blue. Sometimes they're purple or red or even white. And so these are cool. They're washable markers. It'll say on there that it's water soluble ink. And so that means that after you mark it, you can wash your item when you're finished with it and all the marks you make should disappear. They always recommend that you do a test piece. And so you take a scrap of the fabric that you're going to use, you mark it, and then you wash it out just to make sure it's going to disappear like it should. But most of the time it does. Again, you're not going to want to use things like this on anything that's going to be dry clean only or that you're not going to wash, because it only is going to disappear when you wash it. A last kind that I want to discuss that I don't have with us today, but it looks just like this kind of pen, is one that disappears with heat. And so you iron it off, which is really cool, especially if it's something you're not going to be able to wash. It works just the same. And so you mark your item in whatever way that you need to. And when you're finished with your project, you just run your iron over it and that makes the ink disappear. So that's a really cool thing too. That's a kind of specialty item. It may be a little more difficult to find and it might be the kind of thing you have to order online. But that's another option when you are marking your project as well. Another thing that comes in handy when you're preparing your project is a hole puncher. And so you'll notice on some of your patterns, which like I said, we will look at pattern reading another time, but there will be places where there are circles to mark certain things. And so you can punch out those circles on your pattern so that you can just mark them right onto your project there, rather than trying to trace a circle, because tracing a circle is very difficult, but just punching one out and then drawing it with something else is a much easier way to do it. So when you get started sewing, it may be helpful to have a thimble. There's all kinds of different thimbles that keep your fingers safe from all the sharp little pins and needles that we're going to talk about soon. This is a classic thimble. They make them in different sizes depending on what finger you'd like to use them on, and it really depends on what kind of sewing you're doing, particularly with hand sewing. Some people like it on their thumb, so that they can press against it and not hurt their finger. Sometimes people find that they're bumping their index finger. So whatever finger you find is prone to injury when you're sewing, that's going to be a good one to use your thimble on. So that's kind of your standard type here. This one here is a cuff, and so it's made out of leather, and it's got a little metal piece here. So that's one type. They also make them out of plastic or out of sort of gel types of material. And so you can kind of play around with different types of thimbles and figure out which one is most comfortable. Whatever's going to be helpful to you and isn't going to be in your way while you're sewing is going to be the one you want to choose. Here we have all different kinds of sewing needles, and so just to talk a little bit about what they're for. And so I find it really helpful to have a divider like this to keep track of the different kinds of needles that I have. Of course, that's not necessary. It's only helpful if you're really going to sew a lot. A lot of times they just come in a packet that's flat, more like this, or maybe one that's in a circle, and that's totally fine way to keep your needles as well. But just looking at these a little bit, so if I just pulled out one that says regular point, I would just shake it out like that. I've got a couple different ones here. This is going to be the one that you typically use for hand sewing. And so you're going to see here, it's got the little eye here where you put your thread, and it's going to have a nice sharp tip here. The other kinds that we have here are ballpoint, and so those have a rounded tip, just like a ballpoint pen. That's going to be for fabrics that you don't want to snag with your needle, and so we'll talk a little bit more about fabrics later on. You also have heavy duty needles, and so those are going to be for thicker fabrics that you need a stronger needle for. And then sheer, so that's going to be for your delicate fabrics that are going to be really important to use a very sharp needle with. And so those are different kinds there. We have here a needle threader, and so this can help you with those little tiny eyes. And so if you use this kind of needle threader, you put your thread through the loop that's there, and then you guide it through the eye of your needle like that, and then you pull it out the other end. So some people find that that's helpful in threading their needles if you find that a difficult task. And don't worry if you do, even experienced sewists find that challenging sometimes. Another cool thing that's out on the market now are these self-threading needles. And so you see here in the little diagram on the package, it has a little hook instead of an actual closed eye like you would have in your standard needles like we just talked about. Those are very helpful in threading your needle, and they can be a lot easier to use for some things. One warning I will give about that though is with some delicate fabrics, that hook is going to catch your fabric, and so you want to be thoughtful about when to use these. I wouldn't use them for something really silky or smooth that you want to not snag. The other thing is that sometimes it's going to make you thread your needle, so it'll drop the thread as you're sewing. So you have to be kind of mindful that it's open when you're sewing. So even though it is easier to thread, I wouldn't recommend these if you're brand new at sewing, because you want to have your sewing strategy down and get your technique well under control before you use one that has an open eye like this, because like I said, you have to adjust a little bit to that tendency for it to drop your thread. I have here some specialty hand sewing needles. As you can see, these are huge. And so these are not going to be standard items in your sewing kit. But if you have specialty projects, just know that there are needles out there for those. And so this long skinny one here, this is called a basting needle. And so that's going to be for repair work. We're not going to talk too much about mending in this series, but hopefully soon we'll talk about mending a little bit more. But if you're going to do any sort of basting or mending, that's a good option. This really huge one is a doll needle. So if you're going to be doing any sort of doll making or stuffed animal making, things like that, it might be helpful to use a large needle like this. These other kinds of large needles can be used for things like upholstery. So if you have a tear in a piece of upholstered furniture or anything like that, or you need to sew something leather, for example, maybe something came loose on a shoe or something, these are going to be the kinds of needles you use for that. Of course, you can see they have much different eyes, and so this one's much smaller than these. And so, of course, the larger the eye, the larger the thread it's meant to be used with. The last thing I want to point out here is there is a very big difference between your hand sewing needles and your sewing machine needles. We're not going to talk too much about sewing machines in this particular video because we already have another video that we'll include in the series just to show you a little bit more about how sewing machines work. But I do want to point out the difference between a sewing machine needle and a hand sewing needle. So I have a little box here to organize my sewing machine needles just the same. As you can see here, a sewing machine needle doesn't have an eye in the top like you would expect for a hand sewing needle. And so if we put those side by side, hopefully you can see that there. But the eye in a hand sewing needle is going to be at the top, whereas the eye on a sewing machine needle is going to be at the very bottom. And that's because of the different way that sewing machines are going to use thread. The other thing about a sewing machine needle is it's going to be flat on one side because that has to do with how it is inserted into the sewing machine, whereas a hand sewing needle is going to be round all the way around typically. So the main thing I want to point out about all needles in general is they do have a lifespan. They're not good for all things forever. So anytime that you notice that your needle is getting dull, throw it out and grab a new one. You don't want to use dull things when you're sewing. So just like you wouldn't let your scissors get dull, you want to make sure that you're using sharp sewing needles as well. This is a seam ripper, and even though it doesn't sound very encouraging with learning how to sew and even being a skilled sewist, this is going to be your best friend. Anytime that you have anything that you need to take apart, you're going to use this seam ripper. You're not going to tend to use scissors for that because you might accidentally nick the fabric and not just the thread that you're trying to cut. This is handy to have even just for household use. I like to keep them around because when you buy, for example, jackets from the store, a lot of times the pockets are sewn shut. And so this is helpful to cut open those pockets when they come that way without damaging the pocket. And so this is going to be helpful for taking anything apart when you make a mistake, as well as just cutting off, for example, a button that you want to sew back on, or cutting open garments that are sewn shut when you buy them from the store. So this is a super handy one to have in your kit. I highly recommend that you have these no matter what kind of sewing that you're going to do. This is a small one here, and it comes in a little sheath to keep you from poking anything in your sewing box. There's all different kinds. They even make some that are large and ergonomic, and they have a little gripper on them. So if you're going to be using them for a long period of time, I do recommend a larger one for the ease of your fatigue in your hands. But this is super important to have. So moving on to talking about how we're going to put together our projects, we're going to talk about pins and alternatives to pins. And so you can see here I have two different kinds of pin cushions. This is your sort of traditional one, and it's a small one, and I have it sewn onto a piece of elastic, and so I did that so I can wear it when I'm working. I find that really handy because then it's easy for me to use when I'm sewing along and I don't want to let go of what I'm working on. It's obviously not necessary to have one on a wristband of any sort. You can have a larger one that just sits on your sewing table, and that's totally fine too. The other option is you can have one that is magnetic, and so you can see here my pins aren't going to fall off that way. This is really helpful to have around when you drop them on the floor, because then you can just run your magnet over and you'll be able to pick them up. But that's also another handy way to keep track of your pins. I have a couple of different kinds of pins here. It's good to know what each one does. And so these that have the plastic pin heads on them are going to be used mostly for crafting and for quilting. And so they come in different sizes. You can see here you have very large ones and fairly small ones. But these are good to keep track of. They're easy to grip. They can hold large things together when you have big ones like this. But be aware that these plastic pin heads will melt if you run over them with an iron. So while they're helpful for crafting and for quilt making, I would not recommend these for garment making. What I would recommend for garment making would be these dressmaker pins. And so these are all metal. You can iron right over those and it won't do any harm to them. They tend to be super sharp and they're good for most fabrics. And so if you're going to be making clothing, you're going to want to use those. And then lastly, we have our safety pins. And so I have some here of all different sizes. These come in handy when you're putting projects together. I find that I use them quite a bit for garment making for all different purposes. And of course, they're just good to have around in your house for everyday use. And so those are going to be probably pretty essential in your sewing kit as well. An alternative to pins would be these clips. And so sometimes you'll see them called Wonder Clips. That's a brand name. It isn't necessary to use the brand name, of course. There are all different kinds of brands out there. Any that you use can be helpful. I have two different kinds here. These have a larger piece here that you can clip a big thing together with. These are a little bit smaller. It really depends on what you're using them for. I find that I use the smaller ones most often because they tend to be more versatile. These are really beneficial compared to pins for a lot of reasons. They're really easy to use. They're just like any sort of clothespin, so they don't require a particular skill, whereas placing pins can be a little bit more difficult to do. The other thing is they go on and off really fast, whereas placing pins along your project is going to be a little slower. The other thing is that they're not going to prick your fabric at all, and so if you're dealing with delicate fabrics like silky types of fabrics, these are much better because they're not going to leave little pinholes like your dressmaker pins would. And so a lot of times these are beneficial. They are a little bit more expensive than the pins, so don't feel like it's necessary to use these for your beginner sewing projects. It's totally fine to put these off on your sewing shopping list for another time. But I personally am a big fan of them. I think that they have a lot of versatility. So if you wanted to upgrade a little bit, this is one of the early things that I would recommend that you buy. So we have here some different size embroidery hoops, and these are cool for embroidery projects, of course, but I also find that I use them a lot with mending because you're going to need to hold your fabric really tight in order to sew effectively when you're mending, for example, a hole or a tear. And so I just want to demonstrate kind of how they work. And so with these, you have a little pin and you can loosen it like that. And you have an inner loop and an outer loop. And so you'll put it on your fabric like this. You'll put your other piece on the bottom like this. And you'll pinch it together like this. Hopefully I made it loose enough. Let's loosen it a little bit more. There we go. And so you want to make sure it's really taut like that, and so you don't have any wrinkles in there, and then you can tighten it a little bit more. And just like you can see here, you're ready to sew. You have a fabric here that's really tight. If you were going to do embroidery, this is a good surface to use. Or if you, for example, had a tear right here and you wanted to repair it, you're ready to go like this. This is going to have your fabric ready to sew here. And so these are good to have. They're not expensive and they're widely available. And they're going to be handy to have in your sewing room. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about finishing. And so even though ironing may not be our very favorite thing to do, it's a very important part of sewing because it helps your project to be really finished looking and give it that completed look. And so I have here the iron that I typically use when I sew. It's important to have an iron that has a steam function, but that steam function is optional. And so here I can steam or not steam. I can control how much water it is. I find that's really helpful. I just picked this one up at Walmart. It was not very expensive. Of course, you can get as fancy as you want to with your iron, but it's not necessary to buy a fancy one when you're getting started with sewing, even though I would say it is very essential to have an iron. And as we go through our projects here for our programs, you're going to see me using an iron. And you're going to see how we use it to construct our projects as well as finish them, and how really finished it makes your project look when you're done. Along with your iron, you're going to have sometimes what they call a ham. And so these are going to be used in garment making. If you're not making garments, this probably isn't very essential. But this one here, I would say, I find that it's really handy. This is good for example, using on a shoulder of a shirt or something like that. Like I said, human beings are three-dimensional. This helps your garment be more three-dimensional when you're finished. And so you would slide it into your garment, and then you would be able to iron right on there, and it would make it more of a three-dimensional shape. They have hams in all different sizes and shapes, so you can buy them that are really small and really long, for example, for a sleeve and other things like that. But I just brought one here for an example. And then another thing that might be helpful is starch. And so sometimes when you want something to really take a shape, especially if it's a softer fabric that's not going to do that very easily, you'll want to starch it a little bit while you're ironing there as a finished project. So that can be helpful as well in finishing your project. Okay, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about how to choose a fabric for your project. There's all kinds of fabrics out there, and it can be really overwhelming to choose. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap for what to know about fabrics when you're making your choice, and then some things to consider as far as pros and cons for different kinds of fabrics. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is going to be woven fabrics. And so those are going to be the ones that have a grid-like weave. And so when we talk about weave, we mean that it's the way that the fabric is made. And so fabric is made from strands of thread, and then those strands are woven together to make a woven fabric. And so on a woven piece of fabric, you'll see that on a finished edge, there's what's called a selvage, as you can see on the diagram. And that's going to be the part that is finished, and it's going to prevent the fabric from raveling while it's on the bolt. That's usually what we would call fabric when it's rolled up in a big piece of it. And then parallel with your selvage, you're going to have your warp. And so that's going to be your up and down thread, and that is going to be the one direction of it on the fabric. And then going sort of left and right, perpendicular with your selvage, you're going to have a weft. Some people call that a weave, so don't be confused. If you hear somebody say warp and weave, it means the same thing as warp and weft. But for clarification for this lesson, we'll call it a weft, so as to discern the difference between the weave of the fabric, meaning how the fabric is made, and the perpendicular direction of the fabric thread to the selvage. And then diagonally across the fabric, relative to the selvage, you're going to see what's called the bias on your diagram there. And that is going to be the part of the fabric that is the most resistant to any sort of stretching or misshapening. And so that's going to be important to some types of uses for fabric. Sometimes you will see fabric that is cut on the bias, so to say. And so what I mean by that is typically with a garment, for example, you're going to cut with the grain, which means that you're going to cut in the direction of the warp, so up and down. But if you cut something on the bias, that means you put your pattern piece sort of diagonally across. And that's going to prevent a lot of misshapening when you're using it. So an example for garment making that we would do that for would be the front pockets on a shirt. Sometimes you'll see those cut in the bias. So that means that you wouldn't want your pockets to go out of shape by using them. So that's why they're cut that way. Okay, so here I have a piece of twill, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the warp and weave and the other things that I just discussed with our diagram on a real piece of fabric. And so this one here has a selvage edge here. So this is what it would look like when it's finished, and you have the little extra pieces that are part of the weft, so they come out from the side. And so this is the selvage, and there's one of those on each side of the fabric. This fabric is about 45 inches wide. That's pretty standard. A lot of times fabric will be in 45, 55, or 60-inch width. Those are pretty common. Sometimes they're a little bit different if it's a specialty fabric, but a lot of times that's what you'll see on your patterns is measurements based on the width of the fabric. And so it's always good to know when you're having your fabric cut at a store how wide it is, and the person cutting the fabric can always tell you. They can measure it before you decide how much you want of it. So just that tip there. And so the width of it is going to be from selvage to selvage. And so if you put them together, you'll see that that's the two selvages of this fabric. So in this fabric, like we said, the warp is going to be what is going to be parallel with your selvage. And then the weft is going to be what's going to be perpendicular. So that's the directions we're talking about here. What I want you to look at, though, when we look really close on this kind of fabric that makes it really obvious to see is it looks like there's some diagonal lines on this type of fabric, and that's a special thing about twill. And so that is on the direction that we would call the bias. And so if you looked on the bias of the twill, you would see those diagonal lines. And so the reason that you have that on twill, just as an interesting fact, is that this is a weave that's made by passing the weft thread over one warp thread and then under two warp threads. And so that makes it a little diagonal like that, and that's why you see those diagonal lines. Another interesting thing is that denim is considered a type of twill because it is woven the same way, except that with denim, you tend to have a warp thread that is dyed with indigo and a weft thread that's left white. So that's why you see that little bit of a color difference across denim when you're looking at it. But that's also why denim has those sort of diagonal lines in it that you can see. So that's the interesting thing about that. And another interesting thing about twill, which is, like I said, a type of weave, really, is that Hermes scarves are made the same way, but they're made with silk. And so if you looked at one of those fancy scarves, you would see the same kind of weave, even though it's a much different sort of thread that's used. Another thing that's interesting that distinguishes different types of fabric is whether or not it is sort of a natural fabric, which means that it's made from something that comes from nature without very much processing, versus something that's synthetic, which is to say man-made. We're also going to talk a little bit about semi-synthetic, which means that it has some elements that are natural and other elements that are man-made, and they go together to make a type of fabric. But first, I want to just start with our natural fabrics. And so the most common one would be cotton. And so here we have quilting cotton. As you can see, this is a lightweight cotton. It's pretty thin. It's very easy to use. This is a handy thing to use for beginner sewing projects. Sometimes these are used to make household things like napkins and tablecloths, but of course traditionally used for making quilts. So another thing I want to show you about this piece of fabric here is that I've cut one edge of it using my pinking shears, just like I talked about when we talked about our scissors earlier. And so that creates a bit of a zigzag cut, as you can see here with this fabric. Now that we know about the warp and weft, you can understand why pinking shears are helpful in getting rid of the tendency for it to unravel, because it cuts across the warp and weft. And so it almost makes a tiny little bias cut all the way down the edge. And so that's going to keep it from unraveling as much. When you compare that to the side that I cut with regular scissors, you can see this one is unraveling very easily. And so this is what happens when you don't cut with pinking shears. It just comes apart. And like we said, that's because this is a woven fabric. And so because it just goes perpendicular, you can pull those strings right off the end and it'll unravel that way. So that's just a handy tip for a way to use your pinking shears on an edge like that. So that was a basic quilting cotton, and you'll see there are a lot of different fabrics that are made from cotton. So even though they have a different weight and a different feel to them, a different drape is what we would call that, which means how it hangs, it is going to still be 100% cotton, which means it's made from the same material, which is a cotton plant. And so I have a couple examples here that are 100% cotton. This one here is a chambray. And so it looks like denim, but it's more of a summer weight fabric. So you'll see a lot of summer clothes made from this type of fabric here, like shirts or skirts or dresses, things like that. And so this is an example of 100% cotton fabric here. The twill that we discussed earlier is also typically 100% cotton type of fabric as well as denim. And so that's another example of a heavier weight fabric that's going to be used made out of cotton threads. Another one that I brought here is a flannel. And so flannel is a little bit different because it is a type of fabric that can be made from different materials. This one here is made from cotton. It can also be made from wool or from synthetic materials, but often you'll find them made out of cotton. You can just look at the label on a flannel to know exactly what kind of flannel it is. But as you can see, there's a big variety in the kinds of fabrics that can be made out of cotton, and that's why it's so common and it's so widely available in different kinds of fabrics. So just like cotton, another natural fabric that you'll see also really common in use for summer clothing would be linen. And so linen is a fabric that's made from a flax plant. It is 100% natural. It also is very comfortable to wear and very breathable. So that is another common fabric that you'll see. And I want to talk a little bit about the natural fibers that we have from our animals in the world. And so one of those is going to be our silks. And so I have a little piece of silk here. Silks are actually a product made from the larvae of silkworms. And so if you can believe it, one of the fanciest and most expensive fabrics in the world is actually made by a bug. So that's a really cool thing about silk. But this is an example of a silk dupioni. There's many different types of silk. This one is called a dupioni because it is a natural silk. Has not been processed to really smooth it out like you see a lot of other kinds of silk. So you can see that there's little imperfections in it, and that's because it's left in its natural form just as it's made by those larvae of silkworms. So that's a cool thing about silk. Another thing that's worth knowing about in our natural fabrics is different kinds of wool. And so without any sort of specifications, wool typically will refer to the type of fabric that's made from sheep's fur. So they're going to shear the sheep, and then they use that to spin it into a thread, and then they weave that into a fabric, which we would call wool. And so that's the most common kind. Of course, you're going to see that in a lot of winter sweaters and things like that, and socks and hats and other warm things that you would wear in the wintertime. A couple of specialty types of wool that you may have heard of or that you might see on your clothing labels would be Angora wool. And so that's actually a product made from the fur of really furry rabbits. And so just like they do with the sheep, they shear them and they spin that into a thread and they make it into a fabric. So that's neat. And then you have your sort of nicer types of wool that tend to be smoother, and those are things like mohair and cashmere, and those actually come from goats, if you can believe it. So just like we said, with different kinds of animals, we have different textures of fur, and that's why we have different textures of wool. And so all wools are basically made the same way, where you would shear, you give the animal a haircut basically, and then you take that fur and you make it into a thread, and from there you weave a fabric. The last natural material that I wanted to talk about would be leathers. And so leathers typically are made from cattle most often, even though if you go shoe shopping, you might find something really unique like alligator or snake skin or something like that. But leathers are going to be made from an animal hide or an animal skin, depending on whether or not it leaves the fur on or not. So if you see something marked hide, that means it is the skin plus the fur. If you see it's just a leather, that means it's only the skin. And so that's going to be a whole different kind of material to use. And that tends to be a specialty kind of sewing. And so that wouldn't be what I would recommend for very beginning sewing. It's a little bit more of an advanced skill, but that might be something to look into later on as you develop good hand sewing techniques in particular. So now we're going to talk a little bit about synthetic fabrics and semi-synthetic. And so a lot of times those fabrics are made from materials that are either a type of petroleum product, which means it's made from oil, or it's a type of a plastic product. And typically it is used with a natural product, if it's a semi-synthetic, to create the final product. And so in those cases, there might be a natural product that is a great deal process to get it to the final product. And so it's considered a synthetic overall. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some common synthetics so that you're a little bit familiar with what the differences are between those and natural fabrics such as cotton. And so the first one I'm going to talk about here is going to be polyester. And so that's going to be really common, especially in your clothing and your house decors, your upholsteries. This one is more of like a home decor upholstery weight. Polyester is going to be made from a type of material called PET. A lot of times you'll see that in recyclables, your kind of plastics and things like that. That's one type of PET. This is another type, would be polyester. And a lot of times when you see clothing that says wrinkle free or stretch resistant, shrink resistant, sort of qualities like that, you can know that that's probably because of the polyester portion of that material. And so while you would say, okay, well, maybe it's not as biodegradable and it's not going to break down as much when the material is sort of at the end of its useful lifespan, it also is going to last a little longer and it may hold its shape better. And so some pros and cons might depend on what the use of it's going to be, because maybe it lasts a lot longer before it's going to end up in the trash versus something that's 100% cotton. And it also might not wear out as fast over time. And so the other thing is about a synthetic fabric like this is, maybe it doesn't wear out as fast, but it wears out differently. So some people like to say that they like the softening that happens with natural fabrics as they start to wear. You're going to have less of that softening kind of thing with a synthetic fabric because it's made not to do that. And so thinking about that when you're choosing a particular kind of fabric. And some other kinds of synthetics that I just wanted to highlight here is this is a type of satin. And so while it's possible to have a silk satin, which is sort of a higher quality and more expensive type that is made from silk, like I said, it's a more processed kind of silk. So it makes it smooth versus being kind of bumpy like the raw silk is. Synthetic satin is going to be less expensive and more common because of that. And so a lot of times when you see the fabrics like satin, those are going to be a type of synthetic as well. So now I want to talk about these kind of fancy fabrics here. Okay. All right. And so I brought here too some sort of lighter weight fabrics, and these are also going to be different types of synthetics. And so I'll just talk a little bit about each one. And so this one is a viscose. It's the kind of fabric that would be used in lightweight garments, for example, blouses and things like that, scarves and other lightweight items. Viscose is one of those semi-synthetic materials as well because it is partly man-made and partly natural. The natural part of it is that it's made from wood pulp. So sort of the waste product of cutting down trees and processing them for lumber, that pulp that is left over from some sorts of processes like that can be used to make viscose. The other part is the synthetic portion. Sorry. The other part is the synthetic portion. And so when it's processed, those two pieces go together, and what results is this viscose fabric here. This is a similar type of fabric here. This particular one is completely synthetic. And what's different about it versus the one that's partially natural is the sheen on it. And so this one that's completely synthetic is very shiny. It's very silky. It definitely has a different weight to it and a different drape to it. So that means it's going to hang differently when it's a piece of a garment versus this one that is not as shiny and it has a little bit of a different kind of weight to it. And so by combining materials in different ways, manufacturers are able to make different kinds of fabrics that behave in different ways. And those are good things to consider when you're choosing fabrics. Synthetics can vary in all kinds of ways. And just to show you how drastically different they can be, this is also another kind of synthetic. And so this is what we would call tulle. Or there could be netting or anything like that that would be used for costumes and for wedding dresses and formal wear, things like that. And so this is another kind of fabric that has what we would call very unnatural qualities to it. And so that would allow it to be very stiff and to have the weight to embroider on it. And so this is embroidered fabric here. And so it can have all of these qualities because of the different chemical makeup of the man-made materials that make up the fabric. And so synthetics, while they are maybe not made of natural things and maybe they don't break down as much when we throw them away, they do open up a great deal of possibility in what they can do as far as the uses for these fabrics. And so sometimes you should consider using the synthetics because they give you different options than natural fabrics could. And so just as a comparison for a leather, which is going to be a natural product like we talked about, I brought here a vinyl, which looks a little bit like leather, but it is quite different for a couple of reasons. And so this is going to be actually man-made entirely. There's not a natural element about vinyl. And so it is made of ethylene and chlorine, and it is considered a type of plastic. And the way that it is worn is a little bit different, particularly in the way that it ages. So one thing that's going to be different about a vinyl or another synthetic that's similar to that compared to a leather is if you've ever worn a leather item like a shoe, a belt, anything like that, you know that when it wears over time, it gets soft and a little bit creased. It has that sort of rugged look to it. A lot of times you want to use oil or shoe polish to try to keep it in good condition because it helps moisten the leather and things like that, makes them last longer. Unfortunately, when you have vinyls like this, once they crack, they're sort of nearing the end of their lifespan because they don't respond well to just polishing and things like that because they're not natural. And so even though they are pretty durable and they can be resistant for vinyl, like for example, if you have a tablecloth or something, you can spray cleaner on it and wipe it clean with something wet, and that's very helpful. So they have a lot of uses, but also when they begin to wear, they're sort of at the end of their lifespan, and so they're going to have to be replaced, whereas a leather is more likely to be continued to be used until it completely falls apart, because we do have ways that we can maintain leathers, which we can't use on our synthetic fabrics like vinyl. So now I want to talk a little bit about knit fabrics, which are made in a completely different way than our woven fabrics. And so when we talked about our cotton and a lot of our natural fabrics earlier, we showed you this diagram where there was a grid type of weave where you had your warp in one direction and then your weft that was perpendicular, and that's what we would call a woven fabric. If you look at this other diagram, you can see that what's special about knits is the way that that we weave them. And so instead of having the grid type of weave, you're going to see that it's more of a loop type of weave, and that loop allows the fibers to stretch and gives you a more pliable fabric. And so that's what is the main difference between a woven fabric and a knit. The last kind of stretch fabric that we're going to talk about is going to be spandex. And so an interesting trivia fact about spandex is that it is an anagram for expands. And so if you wrote the word backwards, then you get the name spandex. And so that's just a fun fact there. And so Lycra is a brand name that's a kind of spandex. And so with these kind of fabrics, you might even see it called elastane. So elastane, Lycra, and spandex are very similar. They're basically the same kind of fabric. And another requirement about that kind of fabric is that they're at least 85% polyurethane, and so that's one quality about them manufacturing wise that keeps them similar. So the reason that this is interesting compared to the ones we've already seen is that this is considered a four-way stretch. And so yes, it stretches left to right, just like our other ones from selvage to selvage. This one also is going to stretch up and down. So if you have something that requires a four-way stretch, you're going to want something like this that's a spandex that has a whole lot of stretch, both going up and down and left to right. So if we look at that compared to one of the other ones like I showed, your spandex is going to go this way and that way, and your other one is going to go just this way, but not really that way. And so you can tell the big difference that would make in a garment if it required a four-way stretch and you were to use the only two-way stretching fabric. So be mindful of that too. And just like you would measure how far it stretches, like I explained before, make sure that it stretches that distance in both directions so that it satisfies the requirements for that kind of project. Another cool fact, as far as terms that you might hear used, is thread count. And so what does that mean? That is a measure of how many threads there are per inch. So TPI, threads per inch. And so if you took a 1 inch piece of that fabric and you counted up how many threads made up that fabric piece, that's your thread count. And so when you're kind of comparing different fabrics and the weight of them and the drape of them, your thread count is sort of a metric of that, because it has to do with how large the threads are that make up the fabric. And so if you have really large threads, you're going to have thicker fabric, and you're going to have a lower thread count because there's only so many threads you're going to fit in that little measurement. But if you make it out of something really fine, a very fine thread like silk, you're going to have a very high thread count because those are very thin threads and more of them are going to fit into that little piece. And so when you're looking at something, for example, sheets, and you're like, what is the difference between a 100 thread count and a 400 thread count? That's the difference. So the thinner the threads are that make up the fabric, the softer it's going to be, and the silkier it's going to feel to the touch. I'm so glad that you could join us today for this introduction to sewing. I hope that you found it helpful and it's a good reference for you as you're getting started, or if you needed to come back and visit and refresh a little bit. And so feel free to come back and watch it again if you found it helpful, or if you wanted to revisit anything we talked about. Again, I just want to reiterate that you don't need every single tool to get started. So it's totally okay just to use what you have and add things as you go. And I hope that you found the introduction to fabrics helpful. Of course, there are many fabrics that we didn't talk about today. I just wanted to introduce you to the kinds of terminology that we might use in future programs that we have here, as well as some basic differences in what to look for between different types of fabrics when you're choosing for your project. To learn more about choosing fabrics for projects, join us for our future programs, and we'll also show you some cool ways to use those tools that we talked about today. So we look forward to seeing you again for our next sewing project.